Okay, continuing on with muscle physiology, muscular responses. So when a muscle fiber is stimulated, it will contract. Um, but there's a whole bunch of factors to that. So the one thing that we need to understand, or the first thing that we need to understand, is the idea of threshold and a threshold stimulus. A little bit of stimuli, the fiber will be unresponsive. Add a little bit stronger, still unresponsive. A little bit stronger yet, and it will fire and contract. And we call that minimum stimulation the threshold stimulus. So it's the minimum strength of the stimulus required to generate the action potential that will release the calcium ions, activate the cross bridges, and cause contraction. In the neuromuscular junction, there's usually enough acetylcholine released by the motor neuron to reach contraction. When the muscle reaches contraction, we get something called the muscle twitch. So this happens when the muscle is stimulated. So acetylcholine binds to the receptors at the motor end plate. They open, allow sodium to come in. The threshold is reached, which opens the voltage-gated channels, which have the wave of depolarization moving across the sarcolemma, down the T-tubules, affecting the sarcoplasmic reticulum, opening the voltage-gated calcium channels, allowing calcium to flood out, bind to troponin, move tropomyosin out of the way, allow the cross bridge to happen, and the power stroke and contraction. So if we look at this in the lab, what we can see is all of these ions, these positive ions, are moving, and that's an electric current. Moving charged particles is an electric current. So we can measure that. We can plot it on a graph. So we use something called a myogram. So on the myogram, we will see a period from the time the acetylcholine is released until the first cross bridge happens. There is no contraction. We call this the latent period. Latent means it hasn't happened yet, but it's inevitable. It's going to happen. So once the threshold is reached and the action potential starts, we have all the steps to make before the cross bridge and the start of contraction. This is the latent period. After the latent period, the calcium levels are building up in the sarcoplasm. More calcium is binding to troponin, moving more tropomyosin out of the way, so more and more binding sites are exposed, more and more cross bridges are happening. This is called the period of contraction. Now, it reaches a peak where you have the maximum number of cross bridges happening. But then by this time, the resting membrane potential is put back. The channels are all closed, and the calcium pumps start pumping the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So there is fewer and fewer binding sites available because the calcium leaving the troponin moves the tropomyosin back in the way and blocks the binding sites. So the contraction builds in strength and then decreases in strength. And this decreasing in strength of contraction is called the period of relaxation. Now, what is counterintuitive about this is that once you set these dominoes falling, they will go the whole way. Once you pull the trigger and have the acetylcholine released, then you will get a full contraction, one twitch. It's called all or none response. It's like pulling the trigger of a gun. No matter how softly or swiftly you pull the trigger, once the trigger is pulled, the bullet leaves the gun at the same force and the same velocity. So each individual fiber will fire all or none. So the way that we grade our muscular responses, the way that we can pull strongly on something or very gently on something, is by the number of fibers that we have fire at a given time in a given contraction of a muscle. Now, there are different fibers have different speeds of contraction. So the ones that do it quickly are called fast twitch, and the ones that do it slowly are called slow twitch. Now, the advantage to the fast twitch muscles, fibers, is that they respond very quickly, but they fatigue very quickly. The slow twitch fibers respond more slowly, but they fatigue more slowly. So different muscles have a different predominant types of fibers. For instance, the muscles that control the movement of your eyeball are usually fast twitch fibers because you want very precise control. And you're not using them for a lot of force, so they can be fatigable. Whereas the muscles of your calf, the postural muscles of your calf, tend to be slow twitch fibers because you don't want to be bouncing around as you're keeping your posture. And you don't want to fatigue quickly. So a single muscle twitch looks like this. You go from the time of stimulation, so this is when the acetylcholine is released, to the first period of contraction. This is the latent period. It quickly builds more and more cross bridges to a peak of contraction, and then as the calcium gets pumped away, you get fewer and fewer cross bridges, and it's the period of relaxation. This really only happens in the lab, because what usually happens is that sometime at around this time, before the full relaxation, you will get another stimulation, and you will build from this point, your latent period, and then it will build from there. And we call that summation. So when you get a series of stimuli, the muscle starts to contract again before the period of relaxation is finished. Because of that, you get this greater force of contraction than the single twitch can generate. If you get very high frequencies of stimulation, we have very, very little relaxation. Before the calcium can be taken away and the cross-bridging blocked, new calcium has arrived and maintains the cross-bridging. If there are still little periods of relaxation, we call this partial tetany. But if the frequency goes up to the point where the stimulation is happening during the period of contraction of the twitch, the next contraction starts before the first contraction even reaches its peak. It's called complete tetany. We don't really get that. We only see that in the lab. Partial tetany is the normal physiology of it. So if we look at this, then the stimulus is coming here, 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 and here. So this is a single twitch, and the muscle's completely relaxed, the fiber's relaxed, then it does it again and does it again. This is a bunch of twitches in a row. If the frequency comes before the period of contraction is finished, the next one starts, and we have this summation. And the muscle never completely relaxed for this time period, and this is called tetany. This is incomplete tetany, and then as the frequency increases, we end up flatlining at the maximum force of contraction for that fiber. So like I say, the difference between a slap and a caress is the number of fibers that happen. Oh, excuse me. The number of fibers that are stimulated will regulate that. Now, it's inefficient because a single muscle may have thousands and thousands and thousands of fibers. So we can't have thousands and thousands and thousands of motor neurons. So what we have is motor neurons branch, and they go to multiple fibers. And we call them one motor neuron and all the fibers that are controlled by that neuron a motor unit. Now, motor units can be very large, hundreds of fibers, all firing in unison. Because when the motor neuron fires, all the fibers that it controls contract. If the number of fibers is very small, it's going to be a weak motor unit. So we'll see this in a lot of fine control. So when we need more strength, we just recruit more motor units. So if there's a high intensity, you want your biceps to be contracting more strongly, then you recruit more motor units. The maximum tension that a muscle can create is when all the motor units have been recruited all at the same time. That almost never happens. That really overgenerates strength. In class, I often tell a story of helping a buddy of mine move, and he was an English major, and he had thousands of books, and so he had a room that was his reading room, and it was bookshelves on all four walls. And when he was moving, he had got a whole bunch of these 2 cubic foot boxes and packed all the books in them, and they were piled in the middle of the room. And so I was carrying them out to the trunk. So I would go into that room, pick up this heavy freaking box of books, carry it out to the truck, put it down, go back and get another one. Well, he had bought all of these boxes that were the same from U-Haul, and all he wrote on them was library, but because they would stack better. What he didn't tell me is that some of these 2 cubic foot boxes he had pillows in from his reading chair. So after carrying about 10 boxes of books, I went in and I picked up a box that had pillows in it, except I didn't realize it. Well, I practically threw it to the ceiling because I had expected a heavy, heavy box, and I recruited a whole bunch of motor units to lift it. And when the when the box turned out to be light, I had recruited far too many motor units. So there is this control. We tend to recruit as many motor units as it takes to do the job. Okay, so this is a little diagram with two motor neurons. The one doing the purple fibers and the other one doing the reddish pink fibers. It may be within the same fascicle, but all the purple ones will contract at the same time and therefore are a motor unit 1 in this case. So between summation and recruitment, we can get this sustained contraction of increasing strength. Now, what also will happen is if I am using, so say I'm using 10% of the motor units in a given muscle to do a task, and those fibers start running out of ATP and they become fatigued, what happens is that motor unit drops out and we recruit a new one that hadn't been used. So you're still using 10% of your motor units, but it's not the same 10% 30 seconds later. So yeah, and you'll see that as you get fatigued. So say you're carrying a suitcase for a while, and all of a sudden your arm starts to tremble. It's because of this recruitment. There's always some motor units firing, so muscle has a resting tone. Tone is really important for the health of muscle. So I'm going to end this one here, and the next video we'll pick up at smooth muscle.